Hello. Word this unless you get pissed off about that. We don't put it anywhere. And then, but eventually we may throw them up as a podcast on the site or something. But the goal is, we'll do a screenshot. We'll put it up there. We'll tag you. We'll put a couple clever things you said to make you sound really smart up there. Then, tag PharmaJet or whoever you want us to tag. And then, it helps us get the word out about Sales Platoon. And, that's really it, so it's a podcast style. So, why don't you tell us how you guys started in sales and what put that bug in your ear?
So, yeah, I was essentially, I thought when I was younger, when I was a kid, I sort of thought I would get into sales. And then I decided I wanted to be an infantryman. And I was a paratrooper in the IDF for a few years. And then when I got out of that, I actually had an opportunity to train military in what used to be Zaire, which doesn't exist anymore. And basically, somebody said to me the equivalent of, well, maybe you should consider a different career. Maybe you should go into sales, right? So, it's sort of like, okay, this is what I'd like to do, but maybe I would be better at sales. And so what I did was I leveraged my knowledge as an infantry sergeant to get into selling military surplus. And that was the first thing I sold. And what I always say to people is getting into a good first sales job is usually difficult. So if you can leverage what you know, like if you can get into something that's related to aircraft parts or aircraft service or something like that, for instance, Jared, or if you can find something that's related to the military as a first job, that usually helps because unfortunately, a lot of times when people are hiring, what they try and do is they say, well, I always joke, I go, they say, well, have you ever sold a green type 3 widget? Because, if you haven't sold a green type 3 widget before, we can't teach you. Our sales process is totally unlike any other. And the bottom line is, virtually all sales processes follow the same structure. They're very similar. If you're really good at selling one thing, you're going to be pretty good at selling pretty much anything. But a lot of people don't see it that way. And it's getting that first sales job, which is always the hardest. But that's sort of what I did. So I got into that, and this was right when the wall came down, when Germany united. And so what I was able to do was to get into selling military surplus in Eastern Europe, and that proved to be, a pretty good gig for a few years. And I leveraged that into getting into selling used hospital and ambulance equipment. And then I leveraged that into getting into selling new hospital and ambulance equipment. And I've been in medical equipment for about 30 years now. So what I find is, there's knowing how to sell, and then there's knowing how to convince somebody to give you your first job, which are two totally different things. And really, I've sold in about 135 countries around the world. I've only done international for the most part. I've managed domestic teams a few times, but typically as part of an overall sales organization. So I've had, people have hired me to manage the international team, and then they sort of, I've ended up running the domestic team along with that a couple of times. But for the most part, that's what I've done. And I've worked for startups, and I've worked for larger companies. So here's what I'll tell you in terms of, I think, I'm sure Raleigh and other people have mentioned this. Selling, in a lot of ways, and I really don't know anything about the Air Force, so I'm really sorry, Jared, but in terms of
Not a problem.
what do you do in the infantry? You train around standard operating procedures, you train around processes, you follow procedures, and you get ready for a relatively short encounter, right? So, and that's a lot of what sales is. You know, you might actually be in front of your customer for an hour, but if you're doing the right job, you've prepared for that. You're going to do a follow-up after that. You're going to do a briefing and then debriefing. You're going to prepare yourself. Now, over the years, that preparation and after might drop down, but in the beginning, and especially for really big encounters, for really big meetings, for really big negotiations, you might do a lot more training. You might do a lot more prep work for that short encounter, right? And I find that having that skill set, having that attitude is very helpful because, again, there are a lot of people out there. You can make a pretty good living your whole life knowing nothing about sales just because you're relatively nice and you're hardworking, right? If you're relatively nice and hardworking, you can make sales. But if you really know what you're doing, you're going to sell a lot more than that, right? If you follow a strategy, if you follow a standard operating procedure, if you have a tactical plan, if you prepare yourself, if you're organized, if you're following a process, you're going to do a lot better, and possibly more important, you're going to avoid catastrophes. You know, because every industry will have, you know, what we used to refer to as the fax period, where orders come in over faxes and you don't have to do anything. You come into the office in the morning and there's a pile of paper on the floor from the fax machine that people all night long have been sending you in orders, and all you're doing is processing, right? And every industry will go through a period like that where you have the best possible product on the market today for a period of time, and then your competitor comes out, and if you don't know how to sell, if you don't have processes in place, you know, they're going to eat your lunch. You're going to disappear. So yeah, you can make it without knowing what you're doing, but having skills and knowing what you're doing and having a system and a process is just going to make life a lot better for you, a lot easier for you. You know, those are, I'd say, the key messages what I've learned. And I'm, you know, I think Raleigh and I are very similar in this. I've spent my whole life, I've been doing this for about 30 years. There is never a year when I'm not reading a half dozen books on sales. There's never a year when I'm not taking a couple of courses. And I'd say that's just like in the military, you know, we would, you know, something would come up and somebody would say, hey, do you want to take a course on, you know, fighting in the snow? And I'd be like, oh, sure, why not, right? And those type of things would come up, and you take the courses when they became available. And it's the same thing with selling. And what I find is you take a look at it and say, okay, these are the main building blocks in the sales process, but you can chop them down. You know, can I take a course on building the right question? Can I take a course on taking notes? Can I take a course on, you know, using the right email subject lines? You know, and there are all sorts of different specialists out there who can help you improve on all these little things. And it's again, going back to sort of the military simile, it's like, okay, if I improve my stance a little bit, can I improve my shooting a little bit? If I improve, you know, the positioning, if I improve, you know, can I make these small incremental improvements that are going to get me a large improvement in results? And that's what you know, a sales career should look like, is constantly trying to make small incremental improvements to improve your results. Can I answer any? I don't know, Raleigh, do you want to point me in the direction of anything else you want me to say, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, you pretty much gave away the secret to successful sales career right before Doug joined. So unfortunately, he's just going to have to join another time to get it. It's a running joke for us, but no. So I think that's a great setup for that. I'm going to turn it over to the guys with questions because I'm sure they have a ton. Here's what I captured so far. So IDF, right? That was you.
Yep.
So is that Israeli Defense Force?
Sorry, the Israeli Defense Force. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was just not the International Monetary Fund. He wasn't guarding things, so I wanted to get that out.
Right.
And so your paratrooper said, what I wrote is getting into a good first sales job is challenging. So start with something related to your MOS or training as a first job that helps. Example, the infantry are used to following defined process, preparation, planning within defined workflows. That skill set and attitude towards research and the disciplined approach you take to the sales process will allow you to excel in a sales profession. And so from paratrooper in the IDF to sales per international salesman, he first leveraged his knowledge as a sergeant to sell military surplus in Eastern Europe. And from that role, he found himself since use hospital equipment before migrating to new equipment. When people are hiring, they say something like, have you ever sold a green pipe 3 widget? Then we aren't interested. So virtually all sales processes allow or follow a similar process and structure, but a lot of people don't see it that way. So selling yourself into that first sales job is a challenge in and of itself. And so, the idea is to start to leverage those pieces. And so these guys, separate to that, at Sales Platoon, what we do is give them the distilled fundamentals of selling. So you and I have had enough conversations, understand like you, I've read, I don't know how many sales books, processes, spin selling, Miller Hyman, whatever. We distill it down into the essentials that are true across all of them. There is a framework, there is a process. You will be using CRM. How do you track a lead? How do you develop, accounts, territory plans? How do you get compensated? What does it look like? Customs and courtesies. Distill it down and then give it in just-in-time chunks throughout 14 weeks so they get to apply it. And similar to what we did in the military, I don't know how they did in the IDF, but in the Marine Corps, you had 4-phase boot camp, and they're basically broken down to basically break you down and rebuild you. But as they're breaking you down, you're learning things as you go, but you don't know you're doing it. So there's kind of this applied knowledge track. And when you graduate, you now are transformed as an individual. You really never look at things the same way again. But it only took 14 weeks to do that. And so, but yet when most people come out of the military, they get 2 days of TAPS class and a handshake and say goodbye. And so we think that 14 weeks should be applied in the exit as well, to start from, I don't know what branch I want to go into. I want to go into the Marine Corps. I want to go into infantry. I want to go into become a force recon scout sniper. I don't know where I want to go. I want to go in B2B. I want to go in the sales function. I want to be a B2B seller. I want to be an account executive. I go to Sales Platoon. So this is like the Force Recon Army Rangers Delta Force of selling is the idea. So there you go. So did I capture what you said? Okay. Was there anything you'd correct in that?
No, not at all. And you know what? One thing I'll add to it, because I think you captured everything, is so you talk to different people, and people will say, well, the real top salespeople, they sell X, right? But that really isn't the case because, for instance, I've always done long sales cycle stuff. And I have a friend who says he's never sold anything that had more than a 30-day sales cycle, right? Never. And he's about my age. So from my perspective, I think, well, the long sales cycle, that's really the interesting stuff. It's the strategic stuff, blah, blah, blah. And he's looking at it and saying, well, the short sales cycle, these are the things that are really, you got to be on your toes, agile, etc. Right? So it could be that different things might be a good fit for you. You might be really good at moving cars, right? You might be really good at, real estate. You might be really good at long-term industrial B2B selling. And there are different ways of testing for personalities and figure out what fits you. And you might see that you take, you need 2 or 3 jobs and you'll figure it out. And in the same way, you might see that, a startup is a better fit for you, or a large, Fortune 1000 company is a better fit for you, depending on, the type of framework you want to be in, and so on. There are very, very big differences in sales jobs and how they work, and you just have to think about it that way. And yeah, happy to take some questions if you guys have some questions.
I'm just curious, you said 132 different countries you sold in?
135, yeah.
35. Wow, that's incredible. So is that something that just once you started in the international sales role, you couldn't give it up or couldn't foresee being more stable in a specific location? Or what drove you to that?
That's a good point. So most people in international sales focus on, say, Latin America or Europe or whatever. And I really wanted to be a global sales manager, right? I wanted to be in charge of essentially the whole world. And what happened was, because I also changed product type a couple of times. So with my last company, I sold something that really was sold to more affluent, high gross domestic product countries. And now I'm selling a product which really sells to poor countries, right? So what happened was, it meant that I got to cover a large range of different countries. And to some extent, I did that on purpose, but on some extent, it sort of just fell into place like that.
Are you still at PharmaJet?
I am. So what I do now is I'm the VP of sales of a company, and I'm also building in parallel a coaching, training, consulting company, which deals with helping companies expand internationally.
I just have a quick question. You mentioned working with startups and bigger, more established businesses. Could you go more in depth with that? Because I'm having trouble deciding which sales cycle would fit best for me and which type of company that I'd be most interested in working for and how I could be most successful.
So here's the big difference. If you, let's say, you go to work for a Fortune 1000 company, they are going to give you something to do. And there will be somebody to guide you, and there will be, a good playbook, and there will be good training material, and there will probably be good onboarding stuff and all of this, right? And there's a huge advantage to that, because especially for your first job, right, where you'll learn a lot, but your scope of responsibility will be extremely specific and well-defined and inflexible, right? Now, let's say you go to a startup. What could very well happen is you'll get there and they'll say, okay, that's your desk, start selling. And you'll start figuring things out. And you might just say, I was assigned these 3 accounts, but I think I'm going to try selling to a few other accounts too, and nobody will argue with you. You can build and shape your position the way you want it to be in a lot of cases. And there's always the opportunity where you're getting a cup of coffee in the kitchen and you see the CEO and you start talking and he says, hey, Todd, maybe I'm going to make you director of telephone sales, because why not, right? So everything is very flexible in a startup. Now, what's the downside? Well, first of all, 9 out of 10 startups fail, right? Secondly, why do they fail? Because the CEO is an idiot. So typically, if you're working for a Fortune 500 company or Fortune 1000 company, the people you report to know what they're doing. They might be very slow. They might be very square. There might be a lot of things going on with them, but they've made it through, producing year after year for 20 years. You could go to a startup, and what you find is there's some guy who's really, really, really good at physics in college. He invented some really cool piece of plastic that you can stick in somebody's heart, and now he's the CEO of a company, but he knows absolutely nothing about business, right? And I'm saying that almost jokingly, but that's the way the world works, right? So suddenly you're dealing with people who don't know what they're doing. You've tied your future up to them, and they could make a mistake that costs you 2 years of your life, right? So that's the difference between a startup and an established company. There are benefits and problems with each of them. Now, here's the other part of it is, so let's say you go in, how old are you, Todd?
24.
Okay, so let's say you go in at 25 to a Fortune 1000 company. At 27, you've learned an awful lot, right? And maybe at 27, then you go and you become the VP of sales of a startup because you've learned an awful lot, right? Maybe. Now, let's say you go into a startup at 25, conceivably, within 6 months, they've made you VP of sales, but you still don't know what you're doing, right? Or you don't know a lot of what you're doing, which means maybe you're 29, you exit from the company and you've made a chunk of money, you walk away with a couple $100,000 maybe. You've been the VP of sales, but you still don't know how to run a company because nobody ever taught you, right? Now, that could be a good thing. Maybe you go and you start another, you start with another startup and you do that over and over again. Each time you walk away with a chunk of money. That could very well be the case, right? But it could also be the case that you find yourself at 25 or 35 or 40 and you still really don't know how to set up a playbook. And you don't really know how to set up an onboarding program because nobody's ever taught you, right? So it depends really how comfortable you are with being able to learn all this stuff by yourself. If you go to a startup, nobody's going to teach you anything. They're just going to throw you in the cold water and you got to figure it out yourself. Now, that could work for you or maybe it won't work for you. I've done a bunch of startups. I've done a bunch of settled companies, right? But I'm very good at learning things from books or courses or online or by myself. A lot of people aren't, right? So it really depends on that kind of thing. On the other hand, again, here's the thing. I'm a little prejudiced against startups. I've been in, I want to say 7 startups over the years, and really I haven't made a penny out of any of them. And nothing noticeable because even when they did exit and sell, I didn't make as much money as I thought I was going to, and some of them failed. So you take a look and say, okay, so you spend 2 years with a startup and it goes bankrupt because of a mistake somebody else made, nothing you can do about that, right? So you got to weigh the pros and the cons. On the other hand, having it's like look at it this way. Think about, your friends from high school, how much responsibility they've had at 24 compared to how much responsibility you've had at 20, right? It's the same thing. You go into a startup and then suddenly you find yourself running a department of a startup and dealing with all this stuff, whereas a Fortune 1000 company might never give you that level of responsibility, right? So that's what you got to balance out.
Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Great. So I think the other thing that we can talk about a little bit is, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with training these organizations and helping people. You're setting yourself up for that, and some of the things that you see are successful. Obviously, you get to work with a lot of companies. What are you seeing they struggle with? What are they good at, and what can these guys be aware of?
So I'll tell you what I would say that the biggest problem companies have in selling in general is, I always say we're in America, everybody thinks he knows how to sell, right? And I like to use this as an example. So I was in reconnaissance, and a few years ago, I was out with a guy I worked with who was just a typical American man, and I said, we're going back to our hotel. We should turn left. And he said, I think we should turn right. And I said, believe me, you never want to argue with me about direction. And he said, no, Zach, I'm pretty good with directions. I said, you go right, I'll go left. Now, he was really fast runner. By the time we got back to the hotel, I was sitting in the lobby reading a newspaper. I said to him, I said, as good as you think you are with maps, you're never going to be as good as I am with maps, right? Because I know, I understand the sense of direction, right? And everybody, and I use that as an example because everybody in America thinks they know how to sell, right? And why is that relevant? Because you're always dealing with people. You would, if you're the VP of sales in a company, you never go down to the factory and say, hey, I think we should switch the lubrication we're using on the machinery because I just read this article about this new lube that came out, right? You would never think about doing that. But if you're in sales, everybody you ever run into in the hallway is going to have an idea about how you can improve the sales process, right? And even if they've never sold anything. Now, what's this relevant to me is I'm always dealing with people who say, well, I have this idea, I think we should translate our brochures using Google Translate into Urdu. I'm like, that is a huge mistake. Don't do that, right? But people get these ideas in their heads, and I'm trying to deal with it. Now, the best way, this is not so much sales related, but I guess it touches on it. The very best way a company can increase the value of that company is through international sales, right? If you build up your international sales footprint, the value of that company, pretty much you can add, if you increase your international sales to represent about 10% of your overall sales, you can drive up the value of the company by 30%, 50%, right? That's pretty much the math. So it makes a lot of sense to drive up the international sales, the international sales. And that's basically what I do. And going back to what I said a few minutes ago about like incremental changes, that's the way I look at it, is you're not going in and changing. You don't go in and say, well, I'm going to make one change and everything's going to get better. You're basically going in and you're saying, well, let's figure this out. Let's look at these pieces of the sales process. How do we improve this? How do we improve this? How do we improve this? And as you improve these things, the sales just shoot up. And that's basically what I do. So what I call myself a coach for international sales managers. And what I do is I work with vice presidents of international sales and directors of international sales and occasionally CEOs, and I advise them on how they can grow their international sales. Does that do what you were looking for, Raleigh?
Yeah, no, I think it's really useful. And
you can reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a presence on LinkedIn. I have a YouTube channel. I put out a video 20 times a month. I put out a video on selling. So you can, subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can find me on LinkedIn, connect with me on LinkedIn. And if I can help you in your journey, let me know. And, when you're in position in a few years, if you need to work, if you're looking for somebody to help your company with national sales, reach out to me.
Yeah, there you go. Awesome. How about Doug? I know you joined late, so we're giving you a little bit of a hard time. I know you were busy, but can you, and had a little technical stuff. You want to introduce yourself to Zach real briefly, and then we'll, if you have any questions, you or Jared, would be great.
Yeah, certainly. Doug Collins. I'm just retiring after 21 years in the Marine Corps. I've been a combat engineer, recruiter, and an HR person for the Marine Corps. Done a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Got my MBA from Norwich University, and found when I was on recruiting duty, I had a passion for the sales side of what we were doing. Helping people get from where they currently were to where they were trying to go. It was something I really enjoyed. So I'm seeing where this journey can take me.
Awesome. So, yeah. How about Jared? You got anything else for him or questions for Zach? You got to. quite the sales leader here. So, you know, personal, professional, anything with it.
Yeah, definitely. I have a real interest in anything international. Living abroad for 14 years of my career and having a foreign spouse. Now I'm going back to Europe for a little bit. Definitely interested in a career in international sales. I was wondering if you had a recommendation of what type of roles to target first in some of my.
Again, so here's the thing. Do you mind me asking, what do you do in the Air Force?
I was police and I trained dogs to find bombs. So,
okay, so you're not like a mechanic or anything. So here's the thing. I'm not quite sure you can leverage that particular skill set, right? But you've spent time in foreign countries, which is typically more than most Americans, right? And you said something about going to England now for a few months. So a lot of American multinationals right now have their headquarters in London, right? So you might, take a look. As a matter of fact, you could reach out to the commercial office in the U.S. Embassy in London, see if they might be able to give you a listing of the multinationals that have a European headquarters in London, and reach out to them, right? Maybe you can get some type of a temporary or intern type of job in sales while your wife is in London that might be able to be something that helps you out or something like that, or even just make some connections, right? But I think what you're always trying to do, especially with the first job, is leverage the experience you have, right? With the what's an available possible job, right? So even take a look on LinkedIn, maybe take a look at companies that are offering possibly private security and see if they have, if you can get a job as a sales manager or salesperson for one of those jobs, because you could certainly speak to the services they offer, right? And if you did that for a little while, now you have a sales job, and then you can shift to something else, right? It's the hardest part is always to find that first job. But that said, very often people don't know how to hire international salespeople, right? International salesmen, right? So being and I always actually joke exactly like that. I say very often they'll say, well, Bob's wife is Italian, we should make him our international sales manager, right? Just because they don't really know what they're supposed to be looking for very often, and they're looking for some type of a foreign connection. So the fact that you've lived a substantial part of your adult life and you're married to somebody who's not American is something that you can speak up to when you're talking to people about this stuff.
Thank you for that.
Any other questions, gentlemen?
Yeah. Do you have a list of top 3 books that you'd recommend?
Ooh, good question. All right, so I'm gonna say that when starting out, okay, there's an author named Keenan. That's Kilo Echo Echo Nancy Echo Romeo. Keenan. Kilo Echo Echo Nancy Echo Nancy Keenan. Okay, and then there's Jeb Blunt. And then there's Mike Weinberger. Okay, these 3 guys each have some really good books. Keenan's book is called Gap Selling. Jeb has a book called, I'm trying to remember to make sure that bottom line is anything by Jeb Blunt and anything by Mike Weinberger are great books. And there's for instance, there's one called Prospecting, which is all about prospecting.
Fanatical, that's his,
Fanatical prospecting, right? I would say any of those books are fantastic books for core fundamental, so here's here's the thing, and I'll joke also, if you go to my YouTube channel, I have about 25 book reviews on that. But I always joke about sales books. Some of them are extremely esoteric, right? Like, I read this book by this guy. His whole thing was like counting the verbs people use so you could get a feel for how their brain worked, if they were using specific verbs. And I just thought it was completely, honestly, I just felt it was completely impractical, right? These books, Jeb Blunt, Mike Weinberger, and Eden, those are extremely practical. These guys have been carrying a bag their whole life. They know sales. They're not, some of the people writing sales books now, they sold for 2 or 3 years. There's a guy who's really famous on LinkedIn who has this whole sales empire. And if you take a look, like the last time he actually was a salesman, Reagan was president, right? And he only sold for a couple of years, and he's been teaching selling for 30 years since then. So those guys, I'd say, really teach very solid fundamentals.
Well, I'm gonna check those guys out and check out what you have on your YouTube.
Great. Okay, anything else, gentlemen?
Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
And good luck to you. Thank you for your service. Good luck on your demobilization when it comes around. And thanks a lot, Raleigh. I'll catch up with you later unless you have anything else to ask me before I check out.
No, I thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And, everything that we're able to do today and spend some time together, it's always good to catch up and hear from other sales leaders. So let's just do a quick photo while we're here so everybody look pretty. It's easier for Todd than the rest of us. So, the rest of us just have to smile. So 3, 2, 1. Gotta stand up, put my boobs out. But we're anyway. So thanks again, Zach. We'll send a write-up out. You'll see it get tagged at LinkedIn.
Perfect.
And thanks so much for all your time and your willingness to meet with us. I'm sure we'll be in touch soon, brother. There's a ton to talk about. These guys graduate July 23rd, so sometime in August. Let's go back and talk about.
Perfect. Let's grab another drink or something in August. All right, take care.
Be awesome. All right, take
All
care.
right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Bye-bye.